Uh, as I, as some of you know, and as I may have mentioned uh, to folks a little bit earlier, I do record all of these synchronous sessions that I'm kind of moderating. Um, for two reasons. One is so that I can have some record of what I may have said or may not have said, and that may not sound like a big deal to you, but at my age, that's a very big deal to make sure you've said what you're supposed to say and gotten all those bits and elements out there. The other is that, on occasion, I realize that people have some, conflicts and things that may come to play that you just, can't be here every single uh, synchronous session that we do. And so I do have these recordings that you can go back to and kind of take a look at and see what we talked about, how the discussion kind of went. Once I get those recordings off of my computer, I put them up on YouTube and put a link in As You Learn to those YouTube locations. And so they'll be there until I get around getting rid of them, which will probably be the way it's going now with all the memory that YouTube has given me and all the storage space. Maybe never, I don't know, but 20 years from now, they'll discover these things on YouTube and people will be going, well, that's, anyhow. So that's kind of where we'll go with these things. And as I said, sometimes it's useful to have them out there so that you can kind of see what's going on. Not all of you know me. Some of you do. Some of you may wish you didn't know me, but that's okay. I've been at now for about I think this is my 12th year, and prior to that, I was a community college VP for institutional effectiveness and institutional research for a little while. And prior to that, I spent 30 years at James Madison University in the College of Ed, College of Psychology, College of Business, teaching research methods and stats, and in College of Ed foundations, and working with students on their research. Chaired a whole bunch of doctoral dissertation committees at JMU and a program in assessment in their PsyD major, doctor of psychology. And so it was. I've been doing this for quite a while. My PhD was from the University of Virginia in research and evaluation. So I'm a research methodologist and a technical person, and most of my out of classroom stuff, consulting stuff, and contractual stuff has all been based around helping people set up grants and helping people set up data files and data systems so that we could analyze their data and make some sense out of what was kind of going on in their organization. But over the years, I have been in several administrative positions. As I said, I was a VP for a while in a community college. I was a department head a number of years at JMU, at James Madison, and I was also an interim associate dean for supposedly 6 months and ended up being 2.5 years. But, those are kind of what institutions do. If you commit to do something, you better assume you're going to be doing it longer than you had signed up for. But so I have a really good sense about how institutions of higher ed work, the kind of the structure of those things, how you organize those things. I've been responsible for strategic plans in 2 or 3 different places, and different things like that. So it is something that I spent a lot of time doing, and so I was very interested when higher ed, called up and said, "Hey, how would you feel about teaching a class in organizational analysis?" And I said, "Well, it's been a while. I haven't taught that class anywhere in about 20 years, but things have changed a lot, and I think I know most of a lot about a lot of those changes. But yeah, it ought to be some fun. So anyhow, that's why I'm here. Vaishal was supposed to be teaching this course, but of course he took over the full-time role as director of the doctoral program. And so, somebody had to slide in here, and it happened to be an area that I felt very comfortable in dealing with. So that's why you got me. And if you haven't had me, you'll notice that I'm not super formal about a lot of stuff. I have to have an outline or stuff up on As You Learn to keep me organized as to what we're supposed to be doing next and reading next. I'm easily distracted. So if you want to go off on a tangent and explore some subject or some notion that's somewhat relevant to what we're supposed to be talking about, we'll probably go there. And I have opinions about all of it. So the other thing you'll notice is that I'm fairly opinionated, and I do like a good argument, but I never hold it against anyone that we had a good argument. Yeah. Even if you best me, that's fine. I'll be fine with it. At 70 years old, you learn that there's always somebody smarter in the room than you. And the sooner you figure that out, it took me 60 some years to figure that out. But the sooner you figure it out, the better. And then you find life's a whole lot easier. So anyhow, what are we going to do tonight? Really just a couple of three things. We're going to look at the syllabus in quite a bit of detail, because it outlines the content, the assignments, kind of what we'll be working with as we go along. We're going to talk about the cumulative project, because that's the whole point of it, of a class, is to produce a performance project at the end that is substantial and meaningful and somewhat connected to those things that you do on a normal everyday basis, or hope to do on a normal everyday basis. And we'll talk about schedule, because amazingly, I have all three of those things done. And that's, if you'd asked me day before yesterday whether that was going to happen or not, you would have not taken odds on that, but somehow I managed to pull it off. I found out Friday afternoon that my entire spring schedule was changing because the university and the colleges decided they can't go with classes below a certain ceiling, below a certain cut score, and or below a certain floor, I guess. And so I had two sections of the class combined, and another class that I was kind of going to slide that one in, ended up having to go to another person who was also losing a section of classes that were combined, and blah, blah, blah. So the upshot of it is that I'm still teaching two of the same things I was going to do this semester, although I had to change both syllabi to a certain extent. And I'm also taking on a role of a doctoral student mentor, working out of the doc office to kind of define what that job and what that role might be, and helping some doc students kind of get going on their dissertations and proposals. So it's gotten, the semester's gotten pretty convoluted, but we'll sort it all out and everything will be fine. The one thing I did not have to change was any of the content, any of the outline, any of the syllabus. Just had to change a few of the structural things about the schedule for this class. And so this class did not change, but the other one had changed significantly. So, but once again, if you hang around higher ed long enough, you'll realize that you'd like to have a semester's notice of when you're going to do something. You're lucky if you get 2 weeks. And in the real world, very often you get about 4 hours. And so that's kind of the way this wonderful career works. But I must like it, because I've been doing it for 45 years. So there's something. Think about that, 45 years. Doing one thing for 45 years. Well, not one thing, but doing the same field for 45 years. And yeah, that's a long time. Okay, once again, try not to get too distracted. I'm going to go over and pull up in, let's see, there it is. I'm going to pull up my syllabus and share that across. Obviously, you have it if you're on As You Learn, or if you printed it off, and we'll kind of walk through that and talk about that a little bit. So let me get that shared up. Okay. Okay. I'm fiddling around here because after some hardware issues last semester, I ended up buying a brand new desktop computer with the big screen, big wide screen, all like that. So now I can get all of your faces and all of my share stuff up on one screen and see everybody. So that was a unintended positive outcome for my computer dying. But organizational analysis in higher education. Okay. Essentially, what we're trying to get kind of get our fingers around and trying to get our minds around is how, and in particular because of the changes in higher ed over the last, say, couple of decades, how do we get our mind around how institutions need to be organized in order to kind of provide two things. One, maximum efficiency, because we are in an accountable world. We're in a world where money is pretty much tight for everybody. Every week we have 2 or 3 colleges or branches of colleges that close down. Some are across the country. I mean, that's been a pretty steady dribble now for 5 or 10 years. And so we have significantly less institutions of higher ed than we used to have even a couple of decades ago. And the ones we have are under an increasing strain to take more students and to educate those students or prepare those students within the framework of the same amount of money we had to deal with less students. And so there is an accountability sort of issue to this too, that we have to, you have to balance the books. You have to make sure that you can pay all your bills and keep the lights on and provide good, solid preparation and training for students all along. Now that has led to some changes in what we think about higher ed institutions and the nature of higher ed institutions. And certainly the economies of online learning have come into play, and you see institutions like Liberty with a student body of 100,000 plus, and you see a community college like Northern Virginia Community College Inova with 105,000 head count. And you see these mega large institutions, and it's all built around that online model. And so there's been a lot of debate about, is an online model good for everything, or what's it good for and what's it not good for? And, so we're in an era where there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of thought, there's a lot of argument, probably more so than I have ever seen in my 45 or 50 years dealing with higher ed. And from what I have read and what I've looked at and what I've seen in terms of the history of higher ed, probably than pretty much ever since we began to develop this whole notion of publicly funded higher education institutions. And that's a relatively new notion too. We really didn't see that notion until the Morrill Land Grant Act in the late 1800s. And so prior to that, everything was a private school and everything was dealt with in that manner. And only in the last 150 years or so have we had maybe 200 years, I don't know, have we had public institutions. And there have been big growth spurts at various times. You know, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a growth spurt. And then there was that massive growth spurt after World War II when the GI Bill kicked in, and suddenly we had, 3 or 4 million new students coming into the system, and most of them male. And so a lot of changes took place, and that was the last time that we had these huge changes. But now we're seeing that model, we're seeing the same thing again. We're seeing massive changes in the way higher ed is dealt with. So this notion of being able to kind of think about how are we going to analyze the structure of these things, and how can we okay, I think I got it. Yeah. How are we going to, understand how to evaluate these things and how to assess these things and how to get a sense of how well we're doing. And that's pretty much what we have to do these days. We have to know how well things are working. We can't operate just on inertia. We can't just keep doing the things we always did and hope that, it works well for us. It's just not in the cards anymore. And so realistically, we just have to do a bit better job of figuring out where institutions are and what's going on with them, what they're all about. And if your career path is to keep you in higher ed or move up in higher ed, you certainly will be engaged in that process too. Because there's no part of the university, whether it's the academic side, the operational side, the student services side, the ancillary side, there's no side of the university or no side of the college today that's immune from this notion of accountability and utility. And so we have to all have a sense of what it is we're doing, how we're doing it, and what's the best way to make it sort of work. Now, and so you can read, the first page here, and it's all about course context and purpose and those sorts of things. I've provided for you. The next page, I think I provided my cell phone number in case you want to try to call me if you have an issue or something like that. And you're certainly welcome to do so. If I can't take the call right then, I just won't answer. And so feel free to leave an email, a message, and I'll get back to you just as quickly as I can. You have my email address here. That's probably the most easiest way to get a hold of me. Like most people in the 2020, got my email checking on 5 different devices, and I always have one with me. So I'm always my email is going to be pinging my ear. Even now, it's pinging on my watch. And so it's kind of like, I know when somebody emails me, and at least I'll take a look at it. And I said, if I can deal with it, I will. If I can't, just leave a message. If we need to meet, one thing you do need to know, I do have an office in Boone. Not there a lot because all of my courses are online, and most of the stuff that I do with doc students, we do online, except for when we get into the physically have to be there to sign a form type meetings. And so I don't travel to Boone as much as I used to. I'll be down there, this week at the end of the week, and next week at the end of the week, but then I might not be back down there for a couple of weeks. And so the easiest way to get a hold of me is email, and you're more than welcome to set up, for me and you to set up an appointment to meet on Zoom. I mean, we'll have a one-to-one on Zoom and spend as much time as you need to, or as much time as you want. And if for some reason you're enamored to the old ways, you've got a faint hint of that Luddite blood running around in there somewhere, we'll actually talk on the phone. That works too. I mean, I've discovered that that's a new old technology. You can actually talk on the phone. And so I'll do whatever you need to kind of get you there. One of the things with these online classes that I have discovered, and I think that it's important to kind of put it up front. I've been engaged in a lot of research on online learning and synchronous and asynchronous classes and those sorts of notions. One of the things that is clear is that online learning shifts the burden onto the student, because the way in which it's all structured, this is the time that we all kind of the only time we'll kind of talk to each other or see each other or get feedback from each other. Otherwise, it's, we'll be going back and forth with, it'll be me to you and me to you and me to you, and not me to all of you at the same time. And so what that leads to is that you are responsible for, you're always responsible for your own learning, but you're responsible for maybe 90% of the activity. And so the ball is in your court to, make sure that you get things done. And that's just the nature of the game. And, if I could stop time, I would have stopped it, 20 years ago when we still had, small seminar classrooms, and we could actually get into heated discussions and arguments, and people would come to the door to see what you're yelling about, but we don't get to do that anymore in graduate education. And if I start yelling at you, you can always turn me off. So, it's, a different world, but it does put the burden of learning on you, as it always has been, really, because learning is always discovery, it's always engagement, it's always, repetition of ideas, repetition of effort, repetition of process. That's what learning's all about. And, taking your concepts from novice to expert is all about, dealing with it by yourself. And those, and figuring out what are the pieces and what are the gaps and that sort of stuff. I know you probably think that I'm staring off in the distance because I don't want to look you in the eye. But one thing I have discovered with this big wide screen is that, the camera's over here and your faces are over here. And maybe I should switch all that around. I'll have to figure that one out. But, it kind of leads me to look over here, and I know the camera's over there. So just, if it's weird, it's weird. I'm sorry. I'll figure it out. I'll move it around next time. And so the syllabus kind of lays out in this first page, the context and the purpose. And it basically is to begin to understand what's going on in higher ed in a rapidly changing world. Once again, you can get me email, best way to do it. Course objectives, you can see it's sort of the typical talk about a lot of theory, talk about a lot of ideas, and then try to find some way to bring them into a practical utility for you. And we're going to do that in a sort of a group methodology. And so a kind of a collaborative methodology. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. Some guidelines, I guess I should have called this course guidelines for success. Keep up with the readings, make sure that that's the best way to prepare for these sessions, is to make sure that you've kept up with the readings. There will be some small group sessions where you'll be working with a team of other students. And so you'll want to make sure you're fully engaged in those things also. Learn to use all these online tools if you don't, because currently do that, because that's, it's the best way to kind of foster this whole process and foster this modern collaborative sort of notion. Attend class, attend the synchronous sessions as best you can. My advice is always to come always, but, I understand there are, situations which you can't, and that's okay. Just don't make it every situation that you can't, that's when it gets problematic. And, you don't necessarily need to notify me that you're not going to be here. It'd be nice if you did, but you don't have to. But I will, as I say, I'll record everything. And so each of these sessions will be recorded and put up with a link on As You Learn. you need to provide support for each other. You know, I don't know how tightly this cohort has been, or how tightly this group has kind of worked together on some things, but you know, that's where you get your best feedback. I mean, I'll obviously provide feedback on just about everything, but you know, sometimes your best feedback is from uh, the other folks in the class, and we're going to set this up in a collaborative manner, so that you have the opportunity for lots of that. You have a lot opportunity for lots of feedback from your cohort members here, and so you know, be constructive, but at the same time provide you know, good feedback, and that learning process works both ways. It works for you, and it works for the person you're providing feedback for. I do want you to, as much as possible, get into to write stuff in APA style. Certainly double spaced. You know, I've got 2 pair of glasses here, and one of them works most of the time, and the other one works the other times that the first one doesn't work. But at the same time, when I'm beginning reading a lot of stuff, and particularly if I'm reading it online, double spaced is almost a requirement. You know, and you know, try 12-point font, double space. You know, that really makes it easy to work with. Your email, your ASU email, if you don't follow that regularly, you need to you know, forward it to your other email or link it to your other email, because communication that comes from me will generally be coming out of the email function that's built into As You Learn. And so the emails that it has in there are your ASU emails. So, you know, be sure to make sure that you can kind of, you know, follow your ASU emails in any way that you can. And there's my cell phone number. So, you know, if you feel you need to reach me, it's there in that section, the communication sections. If you at any time, if you feel like we need some one-on-one, or you just need some clarification on something or whatever, I'll be more than glad to set up a quick little Zoom appointment. You know, I'm not, with the exception of the times that I'm traveling to Boone or a couple of conferences I got to go to, I'll be sitting here in my lavish den/office space. And if I'm not asleep on the couch or asleep on the day bed, I'll be right here in front of the computer. So I'll be able to, you know, respond to your emails, and we can do Zoom as much as we can. We're supposed to put this adverse weather thing in here. I don't know what that means. This is an online course, so obviously, you know, if you've got a signal, we'll probably have class. You know, or if you're caught up someplace and you can't, just shoot me an email and say, hey, I can't get there. I won't be there, so I can't be in class. And that's okay. I mean, we'll probably go ahead and have class, but we'll do it with the, you know, you may have to watch the video of that. I just installed new fiber optic stuff in the house here. Shentel has gotten fiber optic into this area now, and so I'm on a 1 gigabyte fiber optic circuit. So supposedly the weather's not supposed to bother that as much. So we'll see how that goes. But they've made lots of promises, and we'll see how all that works out. You know how everybody's new technology is the best thing that's ever been invented. This is actually pretty good, but we'll see how it goes. You know, the last time this class was taught by Dr. Miller, he required people to buy 5 textbooks. And the last time it was taught by Dr. Boylan, he required people to buy 3 textbooks. And when I looked at their syllabus, they were only using, you know, a couple of chapters here and a couple of chapters there, and, you know, one of them a little bit more heavily than the other 4, but, you know, there wasn't a lot of, you know, taking advantage of the whole text material. And so what I'm going to try to do, I'll do the best I can, is to just quickly scan in those sections of these text materials that we'll actually be using in class. Now, these are all good materials, and if you want to build a professional library, there's a couple in here you probably should have. You might want to have the Manning one on organizational theory in higher ed, and the Bess and D ones. There's a lot of information in there, but I think it's I think they're a little bit overkill, a little bit of wordy thing. And so it's the Morgan thing is really an interesting piece of work, but I don't know if it's necessarily something you want to have on your shelf or not. You can always pull up most of his stuff someplace else. So you'll get, essentially, you'll get all the same kind of readings that were taught in this class previously, plus some stuff that I'm putting up, readings that I've pulled off that, I've kind of looked at over the years and managed to go back and find those things again that I think speak to this changing nature of higher ed and the changing idea of what we need to do in order to understand this new environment, understand this new world. But anyhow, so don't say I never tried to do something for you, but we'll see how it works. And I'm going to stay very carefully within the course material copyright laws. So, if I cut off a section by a page or two, it's because I'm not wanting to get beyond kind of the page limit on that. I don't think there's a hard page limit, but I think it's some language like overly substantial sections of the text or something. I forget what the exact language on it, but anyhow, be aware that I'm trying to stay under that threshold because, I don't need to be sued anymore. It's been years, but those are no fun. Course meetings, once we get to the schedule, you'll see that we're not meeting every week. Some of those other dates are saved for you to do group work, group meetings. A couple of them are just, dates that I can't meet. And so we'll just do them asynchronously with the materials and, prompts to work with and things like that. I may record a couple of videos if they're on some of those that, I've got to be someplace else. And so you may find, one of those overly thrilling 30-minute videos on some purely theoretical topic that, you might save it for late at night in case you're having a little trouble dropping off, and they'll probably put you right out. But anyhow, there may be a couple of those. I've gotten out of trying to do too many of those, but I'll probably do a couple of those for you. We're going to do for the this little section about class preparation, participation. Not really, there's nothing there that's not common sense, but you should know that the grade, the credit that you get in here is based on two things. One is for participation in not only the large scale synchronous sessions like this, but also in the smaller scale group sessions that you're working with. And I will ask the group to kind of evaluate each other, provide feedback for each other. Not for a grade, but just, because that's the right thing to do, is to get that sort of feedback. And the quality of the participation that you're engaged in. Once I finally get past this first session and shut up, then, I'm expecting to hear your thoughts and your ideas and your experiences and not dwell on what I might or might not know because, some of my stuff's old probably, and I may not be quite as aware of what some of the things that are happening to you in educational systems these days. There are two group activities, actually three. Those three group activities require individual papers for two things. and a group project for the third thing, and we'll talk through that. And then there is a final project that is individualized, totally individualized. So let me see if I can walk you through that. We're going to create teams of 3 to 4 folks. This one works pretty well. I think there are 13 of you, so it'll probably be 4 groups of 3, or 3 groups of 3 and 1 group of 4, something like that. I'll do that, if you don't have a preference of how these things go or whatever, I'll just set purely randomly, because all your meetings and all will be online. So there's no real, proximity thing or that sort of thing to deal with. I'm hoping that will help you working in groups, not only sharpen your thought process, but also, be aware that a lot of the stuff that happens in higher ed institutions these days is of a collaborative nature, has to be. And, like the last 3 articles I've written, or last 3 pieces I've worked with, I was working with teams of 3 and 4 other authors on the research. And that's just the nature of the game in which we're in these days, that collaboration is a big deal in higher ed. And so we'll kind of practice that a little bit in this process too. There are 2 short papers. There are 4 to 5 pages. Each one of you will write an individual short paper. And then after sharing that with your group and with me, you'll make some corrections to it. And so you'll put that up for your group. Your group will give you some feedback on it. I'll give you some feedback on it, and then you'll have a few days to make some corrections and finalize it and turn it in. There's 2 of those. One of those will deal with structural analysis of higher ed, structural analysis of the organizational structure of higher ed. And there are some guiding questions that you'll find in the syllabus, under structural analysis. The second piece of that work we'll call psychological analysis. And what we're going to do there is look at some of the notions of organizational toxicity. And that's a term you're hearing a lot these days, that people, are kind of feel challenged psychologically by the setting and by the nature of the setting and by the pressures of the setting. And so we'll talk about some of those theories, particularly some of the stuff that Morgan talks about. And then we'll either provide or have you pull up, online someplace off of YouTube or whatever, an episode of The Office, whatever. And, analyze the toxicity within that environment portrayed by that episode of The Office that you choose. This is a group project. So as a group, you have to kind of, think about how you might, what that thing is. And instead of a paper, this outcome of this project will there are several different ways you can go about it. You can do a collaborative video blog. You can do a formal presentation, develop a 10-minute presentation, 10, 15-minute presentation by the group, or some other digital media approach. And we'll give you, I mentioned video, VoiceThread in here, but we'll give you a couple of options there. And you'll put those up once you finish those, and they'll be up for everybody to take a look at and, kind of provide a little feedback on. And so it's a little creative sort of enterprise, but also one that's, focused around, in a less somber way, this idea of institutional toxicity, because that's a term you're seeing a lot these days, and it's a real issue that seems to be occurring in a lot of organizations. In fact, most organizations. And so we'll kind of deal with that. If occasionally you hear a little bell ringing or something like that, it's, you know, this old house I live in is 115 years old, an old house in an old part of the city of Harrisonburg. And it's a monstrosity, and it's 3,500 feet on 2 floors, and full attic, full basement. But we've turned it into a smart home. We have Alexa all over the place. I'm not talking to you right now. We have, you know, I have the Sonos speakers throughout the house. We have the Ring doorbell. We have the Nest thermostats. It drives my wife nuts. And, you know, I keep trying to provide little bits of training every now and then. But if 42 years of marriage has taught me anything, that's not something you want to try to do, is to train your spouse to do something. You want her to come to it organically and naturally. See those nice qualitative terms that I can throw out there too? But so I'm in a smart home, so there's always something buzzing, ringing, tingling, or whatever. And that was the doorbell, and, you know, probably some cat running around on the front porch. But anyhow, so if you hear strange noises, it's not in your ears, it's not in your head, it's probably one of my devices somewhere that I forgot to turn off. But I think the psychological analysis piece, that little piece, will be kind of a fun thing, and we'll talk about it a bit more before it comes up. You know, it's a middle of the semester sort of thing, so we'll get there as we go along. And then we're going to look at some of the biases that exist in organizations. The third activity, which will once again be a short paper for each of you, 4 or 5 page paper, then a kind of a group feedback, is this idea of some of the issues related to gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, you know, all those things that have put pressure on institutions, because, as you know, not only as institutions, but also as a larger society, we're having to deal with that. We're having to sort all that out and figure out, you know, how do we all kind of live together and get along and be prosperous and collaborative, and you know, not step on anybody's freedoms or anybody's toes, but at the same time, you know, deal with some of these issues and talk about these things without it turning into a, you know, a fist fight. And so universities are going through all kinds of pressures on that. There's some activity in Congress and in the Department of Ed right now to, and the Department of Justice, to take another look at interpretations of Title IX, and perhaps make some changes to Title IX. And so that will once again be in the spotlight. And so it's just, you know, these things are the things that we have to deal with in terms of bias and equality and all those things within institutions. And so we'll do one of these papers. The third consulting thing will be focused around looking at some of those biases. And in here, I've just called it gendered analysis of organizational culture, but we're also going to be putting an ethnic and racial component in it too. And I just couldn't figure out how to get all of that in one big title. So that's why it only says gendered at this point. And there's a couple of 3 questions there that to deal with. And I may be adding another question there. I'm not quite sure at this point. I'm trying to conceptualize one, but that's like the third piece of this thing. So that comes, you know, in the second half of the course. So we got plenty of time to think about that. And once again, there's a little bit of guidance there in terms of what these analyses should look like. And you're writing them as if you were consulting at an institution. And so you're doing an analysis based on a sort of a consulting role. And so there's 4 or 5 bullet points there that you want to pay some attention to as you put these things together. And once again, we'll provide plenty of feedback as you go along. So it's not like you have to have all those ideas at hand right now as we talk about this. And then the final paper, which is a bit more involved, it's maybe 12 to 15 pages, something along those lines. It's you use kind of the insights that you got from readings and discussions of organizational structure, culture, politics, complexity theory, learning organizations, and to look at a higher ed institution or organization and answer one of these 4 questions. And what aspects of living systems do you find most relevant to understanding higher ed? Would you consider your unit of the college university to be more a machine, a living thing, or a cyborg? And before you start going, Twilight Zone and out there, those are actual sort of theories that exist, and we'll kind of talk through those things. And how would you compare and contrast the organizational learning capacity of a higher education organization and a major tech company? Technical companies and large organizations, typically, private organizations like to call themselves learning organizations. Well, you would think higher ed would be one of those, but it's important to kind of make that comparison and look to see how those 2 things stack up. And third option, if in your experience, how is quote unquote organized anarchy in higher education both sustainable and dysfunctional? And there are, once again, there's some theory about this notion that higher ed is really kind of an organized anarchical society. I mean, it's sort of an anarchy because we're trying to come up with new ideas, and we're trying to challenge each other, and they're trying to expand boundaries and trying to do all those things, which is kind of all revolutionary sort of thought process. But we're also trying to do that in a way that functions from day to day, year to year. And so, some thoughts about that. And who is an ideal worker in your organization? Who tends to thrive and who tends to get stalled or get stunted? What concepts from organizational theory help illuminate the ways in which organizations distribute power and value certain kinds of people? And so, those are all a bit deeper. And so they're worthy of a bit bigger paper. And so, I would encourage you to begin thinking about, kind of adopting one of those topics fairly early on. And so as we start working through these readings and ideas, then you can begin to see how they might apply, in those topics in some way, and not save that until just the end and then try to figure out how it all fits together. There will be times in which we will run up against things that, in fact, there'll be lots of times we run up against things that we don't have a concluding outcome, in which we're just kind of left, hanging. And quite frankly, that's kind of the nature of life. That we would like for everything to wrap up and, make sure that everything comes to conclusion and we move on, we conclude the next thing, we move on. But unfortunately, that's not quite the way life plays out. And it's certainly not the way that organizations play out. And they very often have, we're left hanging. We don't have clear answers. We don't get to the right answer. There might be, several right answers, but that makes all of them wrong too. And so, you have to have sort of that open-mindedness as you go into this and realize that, there are things that are just what they are. And, some things you may not meet resolution on. You just have to find a way to moderate or mediate or work around or whatever. But, resolution is not something that you get to in all times. And so I'll try to drum that in a little bit too as we go along. Because, the good leader is someone that has a capacity to motivate people, but also has the capacity to understand the things that can be accomplished but also understands how to not get bogged down in those things that can't be accomplished. Because you may not, as I say, you may not reach resolution at all times. We'll talk a lot more about this as we go along, obviously, and our discussions about readings will help. Evaluation, there's a 100-point total in the class. The participation is 5 points, not a big deal, but can be a meaningful deal at some point in time. The 2 essays are 20 points apiece. The 2 little ones are 20 points apiece. The collaborative activity, the office, quote unquote, office activity is 15 points. The final paper is 40 points. So it is a mastery model in that we are working toward an understanding that you can express in that final paper. And then, that adds up to 100 points. And, I reserve the right to always, go back and revisit things and, slide a point or 2 in if I think it's necessary or it makes sense to do. Take your peers' feedback, take my feedback, and you're almost, there should be no reason why you don't get an A. You just have to, do the work and take the feedback. And, but we have to put all that in there, so it's in there. And so you'll kind of understand that. And then the last page of the, syllabus is all the stuff we have to put in there about academic integrity, religious observances, and accommodations. And I get to tell you that if you want more information about any of that, follow the links and go to the offices where they deal with that. Because they've got folks that understand that a whole lot better than me. So that's syllabus. Any questions, comments, thoughts, concerns? Hopefully no arguments at this point, but Okay, well, you're an agreeable group. I'm not sure whether I like that or not, but we'll find out. Hopefully you'll be a little bit more disagreeable as we get into some stuff. The other 2 things that are on here, once again, here's a rubric for that final paper, the biggie at the end, and there are 3 elements in that rubric: understanding of organizational theory, analytic use of organizational detail, in other words, bringing specific ideas, specific details, specific examples into the mix, and then the clarity of writing, because in higher ed, you can be sloppy about a lot of things, but if you want to stay in higher ed, you better be a pretty good writer. And, so the clarity of writing is a vital part of the mix. But we'll talk about that a little bit later too. Once we get kind of into that final project, we can spend a little bit more time with that. Now, the schedule. And what I've gone through is I've tried to figure out the dates that I know, the Mondays I know that I will be here, or the Mondays that I know that will make sense. And so this is, once again, this is up on As You Learn. To date, just sort of some introductions and course overviews and things like that. I'm assuming I'll get to know you a whole lot better as we go along, so we're not gonna go through this, tell me who you are and what you do and what you see yourself doing in 5 years. And, in 5 years, I'll either be in a hospital bed somewhere, or I'll be on the beach somewhere. That would be a, more realistic thing, but, hopefully not for you, but, for me. But these are the kind of the major topic headings. You'll see references to resources. Some of these I've begun putting up already. As I get some of these more text related stuff sort of scanned in and up online, they'll go up. I should have this stuff from Bess and Dee up probably tomorrow. It might be the day after, but probably tomorrow. I've already put up the Blowland piece. I've put up this couple of little pieces about the organizational structure idea. But, you know, the notion is that these are the reading pieces for that session. And so tonight we're just doing introductions and course overview. Next week is state holidays, so we don't meet next week. The 27th, you'll have a couple of weeks to kind of get through these readings, kind of get into that mode of reading, because there'll be a fairly heavy lift on readings all the way through. You know, we'll, as I said, I'll minimize those as much as I can, but you know, there's some content here that just needs to be in there. The 27th, we'll talk about theoretical windows and standpoints. The normal thing that I'll try to do is to bring some or provide you with some guiding or leading questions before the class session after you've done the readings, so that we can have something to focus a discussion around. And I would really prefer if those would be discussions, and we can, you know, choose, you know, a couple of three that we might do in a particular session, just to make sure that we've kind of dealt with all those notions. But we, by no means will we cover everything that's in the readings. So just because we don't get it into a discussion in class doesn't mean that it's not an important piece. I wouldn't be asking to read it if I didn't think it was a fairly important piece. The following week, we'll talk about higher education context and also organizational design and structure. We'll get into some of those theories. I'll put up the Manning piece, a little bit more out of S&D. I've put up a couple of Mintzberg framework, real brief little papers there. One of them is a interview with Mintzberg himself while he was still alive, and talking about some of his notions about how his organizational theory stuff fit higher education or fit into education. On the February 10th, we'll have no class, but you will have some readings to deal with. These are all sort of more mechanical, accountability-based and mechanistic views of bureaucracy and theory, because you really can't avoid those. There is an accountability piece and a sort of a mechanical piece to organizational structure that you have to be aware is there, and so you have to deal with it because it's not going anywhere anytime soon. And that's when you begin to draft your first analysis, that first 4 or 5 page idea. That needs to go up on and I'll build, you know, discussion boards within the groups, and we'll set up a series of breakout rooms in this particular Zoom link. So each of the groups will have a breakout room for themselves they can use. And, you know, after you've put those up for the group and the groups had a chance to look at the different papers that were put up, then you can revise those ideas and bring them back up into a clean paper to go in February 18th. And that's the one I'll review, is the, you know, the clean paper after you've gotten your feedback from your team members. On the 17th, we will meet, and that's when we'll kind of look at these analysis and look at this feedback. I will not be moderating that one, but the Zoom room will be available for you. And the reason I've shown it in the schedule is because that's probably the best way to do it, is that since you kind of have that in your schedule anyhow, as this is a time to have class, well, that'd be a great time then to meet with your groups. Now, if you find you need to do it differently, then do it differently, but you know, the place will be there, the space will be there. On the 24th, I'll moderate. Once again, that's this notion of organized anarchy, and we'll kind of look at that idea about organized anarchy, and we'll look at the following week this notions about political perspectives. And then there'll be, you know, a time between sort of this discussion of organized anarchy and institutional toxicity and all that, for you to begin to put together these little notions about, you know, looking at an office or a brief segment of an office episode and applying it. Applying these things about toxicity and about organizational anarchy to that particular office setting, and you know, draw some conclusions from it. And once again, this is something to have a little fun with too. So don't make it all that somber and serious. It's meant to be a way of looking at something with injecting maybe a little humor into it, or maybe a little sarcasm into it, or you know, things that you might want to put into it. March 23rd, we'll meet and we'll begin looking at some of these cultural things, you know, institutional cultural things. March 30th, this gets where we'll get into a lot of stuff here, dealing with notions of gender, notions of sexual orientation, notions of you know, racial identity versus cultural identity. Some of those ideas that kind of eat at us in institutions these days. That'll lead to your second paper. April 6th is another space I've cleared for the consulting teams to meet. But before that, you should have you know, already done your paper, your initial draft on this notion of toxicity, and you'll find more detail in the syllabus about you know, the questions or the theory to be dealt with there, and then submit the revised one on April 8th, the final one. And then we will talk about this notion of complexity and living systems. And there's a neat little book that I'll be pulling from called A Simpler Way by Wheatley and other authors. And it looks at, you know, this idea of life in a simpler manner. And how can that be brought over into organizational structures and organizational ideas? And so it's really kind of an introspective, sort of reflective sort of piece. We'll look at this notion of organizational learning. There's some stuff from Thompson, an article by Thompson there. It's very interesting about Google. There are obviously some stuff from Morgan, a little bit more stuff out of the Bess and D text. Then we'll spend a bit more time with organizational learning and give you some time, maybe that whole session, I don't know, it depends on how much we get done there in the previous session, as a kind of a work session for working on your final paper. And you may collaborate with your team members on designing and putting together that final paper, but you must write your own paper. And it must be unique. And so you can't have 3 or 4 of you writing on the same topic. But you can certainly get feedback from each other. And then finally, on April 30th, no class meeting. I will probably do some kind of a video-like thing to try to bring some integration and closing to this. And then have you a final submission date for your large paper of May 2nd. Now, I'm giving myself a little wiggle room there, just a little. Because if I look at your submission on May 2nd, and I discover, you know, well, I think there could be a little bit better work done here in one area or another, I may shoot it back to you pretty quickly and say, okay, well, here's some feedback. Here's what I think might tighten this thing up, and give you, a couple of 2 or 3 days to work on that. And I forget the deadline date for turning in grades. I think it's I don't know, maybe the 12th or something like that. So I'll keep the option of, giving you back a paper and saying, okay, this one is, this is pretty good, except you kind of not doing this thing, or you're kind of not doing that thing, or this part doesn't make sense, and give you, a few days to kind of edit and clean that up. Because I'm assuming all the final papers will be perfect and earn a full 40 points. See, I have high expectations, and I'll not engage in punitive grading, and so we'll see kind of how that works out. Diane, you had a question?
Yeah, that date said April 30th, which is a Thursday.
Is that a Thursday?
So April 27th, you say we have Zoom.
Yeah, April 30th. I think it is a Thursday, but we're not going to meet anyhow.
Okay.
It's a date for me in my mind to think about. That's when I need to get that video up and all that. Yeah. I should have said that, because I think the last day of class is the 30th. I think that's when classes end. So I think maybe that's why I had it. I don't know. Why I do things is never clear to me, and it's almost impossible for it to be clear in hindsight. So if you find obvious mistakes, please point those out. Maybe they're a mistake, maybe not, but we'll see. All right. Thoughts, questions, notions? I'm about ready to send you off and tell you to do some reading for the next couple of weeks. And I'm going to scan a few things here tonight and see if I can get that part of it all up there in the next day. Any other questions? Or I'm sure you'll have a bunch after we get into this thing, but it's right now it's just a process of reading, and I'll put this video up, and so if you want to go back and catch part of it or look at a particular piece to see if what I said actually made sense, then feel free to do so. All right, folks. I've done my part. I've talked a lot. So now it's up to you to do your part. You have to, from here on out, you have to talk a lot and keep me from talking, because those of you that know me that know that I can talk incessantly if I have to. I've got I have a lot of things in this gray thing up here. Sometimes they're disconnected in some ways, but I can, we'll talk about everything from fly fishing to golfing, to politics, to coaching football, coaching soccer, coaching basketball, to the military, to World War II, to, whatever. There's a theory that everybody has photographic memory. The issue is in developing those photographs. It's all up there. It's just getting it to recall is the issue. and I think as you'll discover as you get a little bit longer in the tooth that this is an issue that confronts you daily, and it's not a sign of dementia or anything like that. It's just as you get old, it's hard to recall stuff. And then you remember it, an hour later or tomorrow morning in the shower or something like that. I mean, it's crazy stuff, but it's all part of the modern cognitive theory. So I feel comforted by that. All right, folks. Well, I'll you get to it and I'll get to it, and we'll see how this thing goes and try to give you a good experience. Let me get the share off here so I can cut the recorder off. Oh, there it is. There we go. Okay. So good night. I'll see you in a couple of weeks. If you have questions or whatever, email me. And if we need to do a one-on-one, I'll Zoom. That's fine. And we'll kind of see where all this takes us. All right. Have a good one. Good night.
Thank you.